In the humid summer of 1847, the quiet farming town of Culpeper, Virginia, witnessed something so disturbing, so unexplainable, that local authorities did the unthinkable. Every record was sealed, testimonies from the terrified survivors were burned, and those few who remained were sworn to silence until the day they died. Over the course of just 6 weeks, 27 souls vanished without a trace. No bodies, no goodbyes. All that remained were strange symbols carved deep into the bark of old oak trees, personal belongings laid out in eerily perfect geometric patterns, and 2 names whispered in fear by those who dared to speak at all: Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crow, twin brothers, both 27 years old. They had returned home after a decade away, bringing with them knowledge that no God-fearing man should ever possess. Tonight, with you here beside me, we're going to open a file the government itself has kept hidden for more than 175 years. Somehow, fragments of courthouse documents survived the Great Fire of 1851, and from those fragile pages, we will try to piece together what truly happened in Culpeper that summer, the summer of the Crow twins, and the reign of terror they brought to their hometown. But before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Midnight. Early morning. Imagine sitting in the candlelit silence of 1847, hearing only the creak of wood and the faint rustle of cornfields in the dark. What makes this case even more unsettling is that it took place during one of the most thoroughly documented eras of American history. Letters, church records, county ledgers, yet somehow these events were wiped clean, erased from every official archive. Why and by whose hand? Back then, Culpeper was a thriving little community of about 800 souls nestled in the rolling hills between the Rappahannock River and the Blue Ridge Mountains. Since its founding in 1759, the land had been generous. Tobacco, corn, wheat, the lifeblood of surrounding counties. Main Street bustled each day with merchants and farmers, craftsmen and traders, all moving under the watchful shadow of the courthouse clock tower. That tower had stood for nearly a century, a proud symbol of order and justice. Like many rural Virginia towns, the community was tightly knit. Families had lived side by side for generations, their stories braided together like the tobacco ropes they sold at market. Sunday church attendance wasn't just expected. It was a law in spirit, if not in writing. Reverend Marcus Halloway, a stern but respected man in his 50s, stood each week in the pulpit of Culpeper Baptist Church, delivering sermons to nearly every man, woman, and child in the county. To his flock, he was more than a preacher. He was moral bedrock. Among the town's most respected households stood the Crow family. Jeremiah Crow, one of Culpeper's founding merchants, owned the largest general store on Main Street and several hundred acres of fertile farmland. His marriage to Rebecca Thorne, daughter of a well-to-do Richmond family, had been considered a union of power and prosperity. In the bitter winter of 1820, Rebecca gave birth to twin sons Ezekiel and Nathaniel. Though identical in face, they could not have been more different in spirit. Ezekiel, the firstborn by mere minutes, carried an unsettling intensity, even as a child. His pale eyes seemed to cut through anyone who met his gaze, and his mouth rarely bent into a smile. Nathaniel, meanwhile, was warm, quick, with a joke easily liked. Yet those who knew him best whispered that behind his charm lay something cold and calculating. The two boys were inseparable, often found whispering together in what their parents dismissed as the secret language of twins. They excelled at their lessons under the town's schoolmaster reading, writing, arithmetic. But their true fascination was with stranger subjects, natural philosophy, anatomy, and what the day's scholars called experimental science. Jeremiah Crow, proud of their keen minds, spoke often of sending them to the University of Virginia. But in the spring of 1837, when the twins were 17, a shadow fell across the family name. Sarah Wickham, the 16-year-old daughter of a local farmer, was found dead in the woods. Her body bore strange markings that Dr. Edmund Parrish could not explain. Worse still, several townsfolk claimed to have seen the Crow twins near the very place her body was discovered. No charges were filed, no public accusations made, but the whispers were enough. Within weeks, Jeremiah Crow announced his sons would be leaving Culpeper to pursue advanced studies with a distant relative in Boston. On a warm May morning, the twins left town. Their parents received letters now and then postmarked from Boston, Philadelphia, New York. Yet their contents remained secret. Neighbors were never told what the boys wrote home about. And for a full decade, the town of Culpeper enjoyed peace. Quiet seasons, good harvests, the rhythm of rural life. Until in the summer of 1847, Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crow came back. For a decade, the town of Culpeper moved forward. Families grew, new faces arrived. Children filled the streets, and the memory of the Crow twins slowly slipped into the background of daily life. Dr. Edmund Parrish eventually retired, leaving the post of town physician to a younger man, Dr. Thomas Fairfax, who brought with him the latest medical practices from Richmond. The railroad pushed closer, laying steel across neighboring counties, promising progress and wealth. Culpeper was in those years a community on the rise. But everything changed on June 15, 1847. That afternoon, the stagecoach rattled down Main Street and came to a stop. From its dust and noise emerged two figures, tall, lean, dressed in fine black suits that spoke of sophistication far beyond the hills of Virginia. Their pale blue eyes swept over the streets they had once called home, and those who recognized them felt a chill deeper than the summer air should allow. After 10 long years, Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crow had returned. From the very moment of their arrival, an unease settled over Culpeper, subtle but heavy, like a fog that seeps in overnight. They took rooms at the Culper Inn, owned by the widowed Martha Henley, who had known them since they were boys. Later, Mrs. Henley would tell officials that the twins spoke very little often, eating supper in silence before retiring to their rooms. Some nights, strange odors drifted down through the floorboards, scents that reminded her of her late husband's veterinary tools, though sharper, more acrid, unsettling. Their first official act in town was at the courthouse. Their father Jeremiah had succumbed to consumption 3 years earlier, their mother passing shortly after. The family's property, store, farmland, and homestead had been held in trust awaiting the twins' return. Benjamin Fletcher, the county clerk who processed their claim, wrote in his diary that the men had changed drastically. Their hands bore the marks of chemical burns. Their posture carried a confidence bordering on arrogance. Within days, the Crow brothers set about reclaiming their childhood home on the hill overlooking town. Wagons began to arrive from Richmond week after week, carrying barrels, crates, and heavy trunks. They unloaded everything themselves, refusing all offers of assistance. The contents puzzled neighbors: strange equipment, glass metals books written in languages most could not recognize. At night, lights burned from the upper windows and thin streams of smoke curled from the old kitchen chimney. The activity never ceased. In town, their behavior remained outwardly polite, though distant. They attended church, yet Reverend Holloway noted with unease that they never joined communion. Instead, they seemed to study the congregation eyes, wandering, observing. When they paid for goods, they used gold coins rather than the common paper notes, always speaking with a courteousness that felt somehow threatening. It was not the town leaders who noticed the first signs of trouble. It was a boy. Timothy Crawford, 12 years old, worked part-time at Hamilton's livery stable tending to horses and equipment. Sharp-eyed and attentive, he knew the schedules of regular customers better than most adults. On July 2nd, 1847, he tugged at his employer's sleeve with an observation. "Mr. Hamilton," he said, "ain't it strange that Mrs. Kemp hasn't come for her Thursday riding lesson? And Mr. Dobson was supposed to fetch his mare 2 days ago, but she's still in the stall." James Hamilton, a man of practical sense who had run the livery for 15 years, brushed off the concern. Routines change. Perhaps Mrs. Kemp had simply skipped her lesson. Perhaps Farmer Dobson was busy with the other work. But Timothy kept noticing. The widow Patterson no longer appeared at her husband's grave on Sundays. Merchant Jacob Stone failed to show up for his weekly card game at the inn. The schoolteacher, Miss Catherine Brennan, had not opened the schoolhouse for 3 straight days. At first, these absences seemed unconnected. But slowly a pattern emerged. Reliable townsfolk people with unbroken habits, people who were always exactly where you expected them to be, were simply gone. Their homes were undisturbed, their belongings untouched, but the people themselves had vanished. And so, the quiet watch of a 12-year-old boy became the first alarm bell for the horrors that were about to unfold. When James Hamilton finally took his concerns to Sheriff William Torres, the sheriff responded with the calm skepticism of a man used to hearing every kind of worry. "People travel," James Torres said, leaning back in his chair at the courthouse, the summer heat drifting through the open window. "Summer's the time for visiting kin for business in neighboring counties. I can't go chasing down every man and woman who decides to take a trip without announcing it to the whole town." But Torres's confidence cracked only days later. On July 8th, his own deputy, Marcus Glenn, failed to appear for duty. Glenn was no ordinary man. A former soldier, he lived by the clock. He polished his boots every night, pressed his uniform each morning, and was known for showing up 10 minutes early for everything. Concerned, Torres went to Glenn's boarding house. Inside, the room looked untouched, bed made tight, uniform pressed hanging neatly in the wardrobe, service revolver still resting in its holster on the desk. No sign of a hurried departure, no evidence of a struggle. But on the floor, partially hidden beneath the bed frame, Torres noticed a piece of paper. On it was a symbol drawn in what looked like charcoal, a circle enclosing interlocking triangles lined with strange markings that resembled no alphabet he recognized. The sight of it made his stomach turn. It was just a piece of paper, but somehow it radiated a sense of dread, a wrongness beyond words. Torres folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat, too unsettled to share it yet. That evening, as the sheriff made his rounds, the town felt altered. Main Street was eerily still for a summer night. Several shops that should have been open sat shuttered and dark. No laughter from porches, no clang of pans from kitchens, no children's voices in the dusk. As Torres looked up toward the old crow house on the hill, his breath caught. In the glow of the upper windows, he saw two silhouettes motionless watching. Not the shifting stance of men at ease, but statues perfectly still. He blinked, and they were gone. Only the flicker of the lamplight remained burning long into the night. The next morning news spread that shattered any lingering doubts. At the Culpeper Inn, Mrs. Henley discovered that 3 of her guests, a merchant from Fredericksburg, a traveling preacher, bound for Charlottesville, and a young couple on their honeymoon, had all vanished from their rooms. Their belongings remained untouched. Their beds appeared slept in. But the travelers themselves were gone as if they had stepped out of existence. And carved into the wooden window frames of each empty room was that same unnerving symbol. Fear spread faster than words could carry. Whispers turned into panic. Families who had lived on the same streets for generations now eyed one another with suspicion. Doors were locked earlier each night. People avoided walking alone. It felt as though the town itself was holding its breath. Recognizing the mounting hysteria, Sheriff Torres called an emergency meeting for July 12th. The only building large enough to contain the gathering was the Culpeper Baptist Church. Nearly 200 townsfolk crammed into the pews, their faces pale in the lamplight. Reverend Halloway opened with a trembling prayer, his strong baritone cracking as he begged the Almighty for protection. Even faith, it seemed, was faltering. Torres stood before the crowd, his badge glinting in the dim glow. His report was grim. 23 confirmed missing. Men, women, young, old, from every walk of life, farmers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, even his own deputy. Their houses stood undisturbed, their belongings left behind. No packed bags, no notes, no farewells, nothing. "What troubles me most," Torres said. His voice heavy is the lack of any struggle. It's as if these people were plucked from their lives in an instant. One moment they were here, the next gone. From the back of the church, a voice rang out loud, unshaken, carrying the fear everyone else had been too afraid to speak aloud. "Sheriff, what about the Crow twins? They return after 10 years, and now our people are vanishing." The question hung in the air, like thunder after lightning. And in that moment, the entire congregation turned its eyes toward the possibility they had all tried to avoid. That can't be a coincidence. The words came from somewhere in the crowd, and immediately a murmur of agreement rippled through the church. Faces turned toward one another, eyes wide suspicion, growing like wildfire. Sheriff Torres raised his hand for silence. "I know what you're all thinking," he said firmly. "But we can't go accusing men without proof. The Crow brothers have every legal right to return home. And as far as I know, they haven't broken a single law." But even as he spoke, Torres felt the lie in his own words. Doubt gnawed at him like a worm in rotten wood. He had, in fact, looked into the twins' activities since their return. And what he'd discovered was deeply unsettling. They'd been ordering large quantities of chemicals from Richmond formulas used in embalming, specimen preservation, and experimental procedures. They'd acquired surgical instruments, anatomical charts, scientific devices that no farmer or merchant would ever need. Neighbors whispered of strange occurrences near the Crowland. Mrs. Sarah Dalton swore she saw flickering lights in the woods at night. Not steady lantern glow, but something moving purposeful like fire, dancing with intent. Her husband Robert found carcasses, deer rabbits, even livestock laid out in geometric patterns chillingly similar to the mysterious symbols that had begun to appear across Culpeper. By the end of the meeting, a plan was formed. Volunteer patrols would watch the streets by night. Families were told to stay close account for each other's whereabouts and report anything unusual immediately. Yet, as the congregation filed out into the heavy July air, their eyes drifted to the dark silhouette looming on the hill. The Crow House, its upper windows glowing with sickly yellow light. And there, unmistakably, the same two still figures watching. Always watching. That night, Dr. Thomas Fairfax approached Sheriff Torres quietly. The young physician's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled a worn leather portfolio from his bag. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Inside were the private notes of Dr. Edmund Parrish, written back in 1837. They detailed the death of Sarah Wickham, a case officially closed long ago. But what Parrish had discovered had never been shared with the public. The body bore signs of deliberate experimentation, incisions made with surgical precision organs, removed and replaced for no reason that made sense in medicine tissues chemically preserved after death. And in his final entry, Dr. Parrish had written words that chilled Torres's blood. "I have examined countless bodies in my 40 years of practice, but never have I seen such methodical tampering. The work shows advanced knowledge of anatomy and chemistry, yet utterly devoid of human compassion. If such a person continues their studies unchecked, I fear for what horrors the future may bring." Dr. Fairfax closed the portfolio, his eyes meeting Torres's. "Sheriff, I believe Sarah Wickham was murdered by the Crow twins 10 years ago. And I believe they've spent the past decade perfecting their methods. If I'm right about what's happening to our missing townspeople, he didn't finish. He didn't need to." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unspeakable. 2 nights later, the volunteer patrols stumbled upon something that would etch itself into Culpeper's memory forever. On July 15th, in a clearing half a mile from Crow, land farmers Robert Dalton, Henry Vance, and merchant Samuel Reed found what came to be known as the arrangement site. The clearing, once a place where Culpeper's children laughed and played, had been transformed into something unspeakable. Laid out with chilling precision were 23 personal belongings, a bonnet, a pocket watch, a wedding ring, a Bible, bound in worn leather, each piece clearly taken from the missing townsfolk. They formed a perfect spiral around a circle of stones, each distance measured to the inch. And in the center, carved deep into the soil, the same interlocking triangular symbol seen before. Only this time it was larger, more elaborate, as if an entire language had been hidden inside its geometry. But it wasn't just the earth that bore scars. The surrounding trees had been altered, bark stripped in deliberate patterns, branches cut away to create long, unnatural sightlines. Viewed from the center, the carvings connected into a greater design as though the forest itself had been turned into a machine. Samuel Reed, once a train surveyor, crouched low, his voice trembling as he whispered to his companions, "This isn't random. Every angle, every measurement, it's exact. The spiral follows a mathematical progression. The stones, the spacing, even the carvings. This was created by someone with advanced knowledge. This is engineered." When Sheriff Torres arrived at dawn with Dr. Fairfax and Reverend Holloway, the three men could only stare. This wasn't chaos. This was systematic, scientific, planned. The Reverend tried to frame it within his theology. "I've read of pagan rituals of ancient practices, but this," his voice faltered, "this combines faiths and sciences in ways that shouldn't even exist." Dr. Fairfax knelt by the symbols, magnifying glass in hand. These incisions, they were made with surgical instruments. See here the depth, the clean lines. And this, he touched a darkened stain. Blood. Preserved. Chemically treated so it wouldn't decay even in this heat. And then something worse. From the vantage point of the Crow House on the hill, the entire arrangement became perfectly visible. Designed, it seemed to be watched from above. The altered trees themselves directed the eye toward the center, forcing focus, drawing the gaze like a hypnotic spiral. Sheriff Torres clenched his jaw. Enough. A watch would be placed on the clearing. Whoever created this would return. And so on the night of July 16th, Torres himself lay hidden, just 50 yards away, his heart pounding in the silence. The moon rode high shadows, stretching long and black across the clearing. Then, at exactly midnight, two figures stepped from the tree line. Torres's breath caught in his throat. Even in the silver light, there was no mistaking them. Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crow. The two brothers moved like shadows, silent, deliberate, almost mechanical. Each carried a worn leather satchel and a dark lantern that spilled only the faintest glow, just enough to guide their steps through the spiral. For nearly 2 hours, Sheriff Torres watched in paralyzed silence as Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crow worked with unnerving precision. They shifted items within the spiral, carved new symbols into the earth, and moved about the clearing with the flawless coordination of men who had rehearsed the same sequence countless times. It wasn't random. It wasn't madness. It was a ritual. From his hiding place, Torres could see the twins taking specific positions around the circle, raising their hands in gestures too deliberate to be improvised. The sheriff's instincts screamed at him to intervene, to demand answers about the missing townsfolk. But his body betrayed him. Something in their movements was not quite human. They moved with an inhuman rhythm, as though they were following instructions written by something far older, far colder than any human hand. He froze helpless, like prey under a predator's gaze. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual ended. The twins vanished back into the woods, leaving behind a clearing that was changed. The spiral had been altered, new carvings gouged into the dirt. But one detail made Torres's stomach turn to ice. Among the belongings, a new object had been added. Deputy Marcus Glenn's badge. Torres's chest tightened. His deputy, his friend, had joined the missing. When dawn finally painted the horizon, Torres crawled from his hiding spot. His legs shook beneath him as he stepped into the clearing. But then, his heart nearly stopped. Just above his hiding place, carved into the bark of a tree, was a message. We know you're watching. Join us willingly, or join the others permanently. The sheriff staggered back, the words burning into his mind. This wasn't just investigation anymore. This was a game, and now he was a player. On the morning of July 17th, Torres sat hunched over every scrap of evidence he had collected. The precision of the spiral, the systematic choice of victims, the eerie symmetry, it all pointed to something far larger than murder. It was as though the Crow twins were building toward a grand design. Mapping the missing townspeople chilled him to his core. Their homes and businesses formed the exact same spiral pattern as the clearing. Culpeper itself was being turned into a living diagram, its people pieces of a puzzle too vast and terrible to fully comprehend. And then the news came. Dr. Fairfax arrived, face pale, voice low but steady. Sheriff, 3 more are gone. Helen Crawford, George Patterson, Jane Carpenter. No struggle, no warning. And the symbol. His voice broke for just a moment. The same symbol, always the same. He opened his notes, fingers trembling slightly. I've studied the pattern, Torres. I think I finally understand. There's a selection criteria. They aren't choosing victims at random. They're building towards something. Something that uses the entire town as its design. The room went silent. Torres felt the walls close in as though the very air carried the weight of that revelation. Dr. Fairfax's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of his discovery. Sheriff, the victims aren't random. They're chosen. Torres raised his head from the map, red pins piercing like wounds into the town's outline. Chosen, explain. Fairfax slid a stack of notes across the desk. Look at the pattern. The deputy, the school teacher, merchants, farmers who feed half the county, the woman who runs the telegraph, the man who maintains the water system. These are the people who keep Culpeper alive. Without them, the town collapses. Torres leaned back, the blood draining from his face. You're saying the Crow twins are dismantling the entire community, piece by piece. Exactly, Fairfax whispered. And if my theory is right, they won't stop until Culpeper itself ceases to function. But why? Before Torres could answer, the door slammed open. A boy stumbled in gasping tears streaking down his dirt-smeared cheeks. Timothy Crawford, sheriff. The boy sobbed. I saw them take my mother. The room went still. Timothy's voice trembled as he spoke words tumbling out. Like stones, I was supposed to be asleep, but I heard voices. When I looked outside, 2 men were leading her away. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just walked with them. Like she was asleep. Like she wasn't even her anymore. Torres knelt, his heart twisting at the boy's terror. Timothy, did you see their faces? The child nodded, shaking. They wore black suits. They moved together, like they shared the same thought. One of them looked back and... Sheriff, he smiled at me, like he knew I was watching. Fairfax and Torres exchanged a grim glance. That explained the lack of struggle. If the Crow twins could somehow control their victims. The disappearances weren't abductions. They were recruitments. Torres placed a hand on Timothy's shoulder. You're safe now. I'll send you to stay with the Hamiltons. But I promise you, son will find your mother. The sheriff wasted no time. By afternoon, he had organized a search party himself, Dr. Fairfax and 6 armed townsmen. The trail was waiting. Broken branches, footprints, scuffed earth, it was too perfect, too deliberate. As if the Crow brothers wanted them to follow. For 2 hours, they pushed deeper into the forest until the trees opened into a clearing none of them had ever seen. And there, hidden in the wilderness, stood something that should not have existed. A complex of structures, wooden buildings arranged in a geometric pattern. Inside laboratories brimming with scientific instruments, glass containers filled with strange fluids, anatomical charts plastered across the walls. It wasn't a lair, it wasn't a hideout, it was a research facility. And then came the central building. The moment they stepped inside, the air turned cold with dread. 23 wooden tables stood in a spiral formation, each fitted with restraints, each stained dark with blood. On shelves, glass jars glistened with preserved organs. And on desks, journals written in the Crow brothers' hands, detailed procedures too horrifying to imagine. Dr. Fairfax, who had spent his life in medicine, staggered back, his face pale. He retched violently, clutching at the wall. "Sheriff," he gasped. "These aren't just victims. They were alive. The Crows have been experimenting on living people." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a long moment, no one spoke. "This is torture, disguised as science." Sheriff Torres whispered, his voice hollow. The reality struck like a hammer. The Crow twins hadn't simply taken lives. They had systematically used living men and women, neighbors, friends, townsfolk as test subjects. People weren't being killed outright. They were being dismantled, studied, catalogued, but worse still, there were no bodies. 23 people had been brought to that hidden laboratory. Yet, not a single corpse remained. No graves, no remains, no closure. The air inside the clearing grew heavier. Every man in the search party, aware of the same dreadful truth, something had happened to those victims. Something far beyond murder. And then it came. Footsteps, the sound every soul in Culpeper had dreaded. The rhythmic mechanical march of 2. Perfectly synchronized. Perfectly inhuman. Torres froze, his pulse thundering. The Crow twins had returned. He signaled the men into cover, though he knew it was useless. If the rumors about the twins' methods were true, walls and guns would not protect them. Dr. Fairfax pressed himself against the wood, his face pale and damp with sweat. "Sheriff," he whispered urgently. The notes, they describe chemical compounds, methods to suppress will, to control the mind. If the twins have perfected this, Torres silenced him with a gesture. The footsteps were too close, and then they appeared. Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crow stepped into the clearing. For the first time, the sheriff saw them, not in shadow but in full daylight. And it was worse, much worse. Tall, gaunt. Their skin ghostly pale, as though it absorbed the sunlight rather than reflected it. Their identical black suits were pristine, immaculate, untouched by forest mud or sweat. They moved as one, as if guided not by 2 minds, but by a single, shared will. But it was their eyes that stole the breath from Torres's lungs. Once, a clear, pale blue now drained to a lifeless grey. Empty. Detached. Eyes that did not see human beings. Only subjects. Ezekiel's voice rang across the clearing, calm, articulate, yet unnervingly resonant. Sheriff Torres, Dr. Fairfax, gentleman of Culpeper. We knew you would find our research facility. In fact, we led you here. Nathaniel continued without pause, as though their mouths shared the same thought. Your investigation has been useful. You helped us identify the remaining subjects we need. Your behavior, so predictable, has allowed us to prepare for this final phase. The words slid like ice into Torres's veins. With trembling hands, he stepped out from cover revolver, raised. "Where are they?" he demanded. His voice cracked, but the steel was still there. "Where are the people you took from our town?" The twins exchanged a glance. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't cruelty. It was observation. Ezekiel gestured lazily toward the surgical theater. They served their purpose. Each subject contributed valuable data on physiology, psychology, and the boundaries of consciousness itself. Torres's knuckles whitened on his revolver. Fairfax, unable to remain silent, shouted, "You're talking about torture, about murder." The twins looked at him with the same clinical detachment one might offer a lab rat. Hearing this, do you feel a chill? If you were in Sheriff Torres's shoes, would you dare to pull the trigger? Or would you stand paralyzed like him facing two people who treated an entire town as experimental samples? And when are you listening to this story? Is it daylight outside your window, or is it the quiet night? Those were human beings, not laboratory animals. Dr. Fairfax's voice cracked with fury. Nathaniel tilted his head with mechanical precision, as though dissecting the doctor's words like a specimen under glass. Your emotional attachment to individual specimens is understandable, but scientifically counterproductive. Ezekiel's voice slid in smooth and cold. Culpeper was perfect, isolated, trusting, unwatched by outside law enforcement. A place where subjects could be acquired without interference. Sheriff Torres's gut twisted as he realized they were describing the abduction and murder of his friends. The butcher, the teacher, the telegraph operator, as if they were resources. "You're insane," he spat. Nathaniel's lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. Insanity implies irrationality. Our work is entirely systematic. We set objectives, developed methodologies, acquired subjects, conducted experiments, and recorded results. That is science, Sheriff. The only distinction is our refusal to accept the artificial limitation of ethics. Fairfax's medical training forced him to push past his terror. His voice was thin, but steady. What happened to the bodies? Where are the remains? For the first time, both twins smiled. And that synchronized expression was somehow more horrifying than anything else Torres had witnessed. Ezekiel gestured towards several massive glass containers stacked in the shadows. Waste, not, want not. Human tissue properly preserved remains viable for years of study. We have refined techniques that extend specimen utility far beyond conventional methods. Torres's stomach clenched. These men weren't just butchers. They had devised a way to keep experimenting long after life was gone. Nathaniel produced a worn leather journal from his coat. Our research phase is complete. We have sufficient data to publish, though the establishment may lack vision to appreciate our innovations. Ezekiel continued seamlessly, and now comes the final phase. You see, Sheriff, we require witnesses. Your testimony, your investigation will provide the credibility necessary to ensure our work is acknowledged. Torres lifted his revolver higher, though his grip shook. I'll never help you. The twins regarded him like a stubborn animal, refusing to enter a pen. Nathaniel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small vial filled with a clear, glistening liquid. Oh, but you will. Fairfax's eyes widened in horror. That's what you used on the missing townsfolk. Not abductions compliance. Precisely, Ezekiel confirmed. No chains, no screams. A simple injection. They remain fully conscious, fully aware, but utterly obedient. The sheriff felt his blood run cold. It wasn't brute force that had emptied Culper's homes. It was chemistry enslavement disguised as medicine. But then Nathaniel's tone shifted, mechanical, yet edged with something close to impatience. We have encountered a complication. Our supplies are nearly depleted. The latest subjects proved inadequate for completing our final experiments. Ezekiel's dead grey eyes fixed on Torres, sharp as a scalpel. We require additional specimens, strong-willed subjects, leaders, protectors, physicians, lawmen. And in that instant, Torres realized the truth. The twins hadn't merely tolerated his investigation, they had lured him here as the final stage of their experiment. If it were you, what would you do? Faced with two cold-blooded men, their hands holding useless guns without trembling, and them holding a chemical that turns people into puppets. Do you think you are strong enough to resist, or will you become a test subject? Like so many other culprits, Torres stood frozen as the truth hit him. You guys planned it all. The lead, the trail, Timothy finding us, it was all bait. The twins responded in unison, their voices echoing as if from a single throat. Of course, Sheriff. You did exactly as we predicted. Their unison was like a knife cutting into his brain, stimulating his primal fear rather than his rationality. Torres felt a shadow of despair settle over his mind, but then a detail flashed like a lifeline. The crow's lab, though sophisticated, was hastily built, made of wood and not sturdy. They relied entirely on chemicals and mental manipulation, not weapons or physical strength. Torres glanced briefly at Dr. Fairfax. His eyes flashed with the same thought. As long as they avoided being injected with that absolute obedience drug, they still had a chance. In the moment of life and death, Torres acted. Without warning, he raised his gun and fired several shots into the rows of glass bottles lining the walls of the lab. The shattering sound rang out like a firecracker. Liquid's body parts, preserved human tissue, poured out in a toxic waterfall. Thick white smoke rose mixed with sparks from uncontrolled chemical reactions. In seconds, the shack turned into a sea of fire and toxic fumes. "Run!" Torres shouted, but he didn't need reminding. Primal instincts had already sent the group rushing into the forest, leaving behind the smell of burning mixed with the smell of rotting flesh. As Torres ran, he heard echoes behind him, laughter. Not a crazy scream, but the satisfied laughter of those who had just harvested the data. Ezekiel called out, his voice clear through the smoke. "Excellent, Sheriff Torres." Predicted response confirmed. Crisis leader profile? Complete. Nathaniel added, as cool as a church bell. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 will proceed at a new location with improved methods. Torres stumbled through the edge of the woods, his heart pounding. The words hit him. Culpeper was just an initial test. The real experiment would expand, and then the sight before him froze him. In the valley, the town of Culpeper appeared, but it was no longer normal. From various points, the church, the courthouse, the school, even a few private homes, thin, straight columns of smoke rose as uniformly as if controlled by a hand. Torres collapsed, eyes wide. It was no random smoke. It was a system, a plan. Before he could figure it out, Dr. Fairfax appeared, his face white, his shirt stained with sweat. He grabbed Sheriff's arm, gasping for air. Sheriff, the villagers aren't themselves anymore. Torres struggled to pull out his binoculars. The magnified scene before him was even more horrifying. Nearly 30 villagers moving back and forth. But they weren't talking, laughing, or crying. They were marching. Groups were dividing up, picking up things from houses, arranging them in the middle of the street in familiar patterns. The same patterns Torres had seen in Crow's lab. The entire town had become a living laboratory. If you were standing next to Sheriff Torres right now, witnessing your friends, family, neighbors suddenly turn into soulless machines, what would you do? Run away to survive or turn back? To fight in vain? And hey, where are you listening to this story, in a dark bedroom or on the balcony late at night? The more Torres watched, the more he understood. The residents weren't simply wandering like sleepwalkers. Their movements adhered to an order, a rhythm, as if guided by an unseen conductor. The streets themselves had become conduits in a vast living diagram. Every piece of furniture placed, every object shifted, was part of some geometric lattice that expanded outward from the courthouse like ripples in a pond. Mrs. Henley adjusted a rocking chair by less than an inch, then stepped back with a serene smile, nodding as though she had achieved perfection. Reverend Halloway directed 3 children to carry hymnals to the base of the clock tower, arranging them in a tight triangular cluster, before dismissing them with a fatherly pat. The smallest details mattered to the townspeople, each action performed with the quiet zeal of true believers. Torres felt bile rising in his throat. They're not prisoners, Fairfax. They're devotees. Fairfax's jaw clenched. Not devotees, Sheriff. Instruments. The crows have hollowed them out, then filled the emptiness with purpose. See how they pause, how they wait for one another before moving. Their coordination isn't random, it's patterned. Torres focused again through his spyglass. The doctor was right. At first glance, the movements seemed chaotic. But if one observed long enough, the repetitions emerged. Groups of 4 always rotated counterclockwise before dispersing. Objects were never left in isolation, but absorbed into greater spirals or lattices. Even the spacing between bodies remained consistent, like points on a graph. And then came the revelation. The design wasn't only geometric, it was temporal. Every action repeated at precise intervals, forming a sequence as dependable as the gears of the courthouse clock itself. Torres whispered hoarsely, more to himself than to Fairfax. It's a schedule. They're operating on a fixed cycle. If we can find the pattern, we might break it. Fairfax finished, his eyes narrowing. Above them in the courthouse tower, one twin adjusted the instrument while the other scribbled notes. Their movements mirrored the rhythm below, as if the brothers themselves were the metronomes driving the entire experiment. The insight struck Torres like a thunderclap. The twins weren't only recording the pattern, they were feeding it. Without their presence, the chain of behavior might collapse. For the first time since stumbling upon the crow's hidden laboratory, Sheriff Torres felt something stronger than despair pressing at his ribs. It was dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but there was now a crack in the experiment's design, and cracks could be widened. They responded to the twins' influence, yes, but they weren't soldiers. They weren't armed. They weren't even hostile. The townspeople were workers, drones, instruments of someone else's will. And Torres noticed something else, something critical. Their strange state of mind seemed to require constant nourishment. Every glance upward, every pause in their mechanical tasks was followed by another word or gesture from the brothers above. Dr. Fairfax. Torres whispered, his voice low but fierce. If we can sever that link, separate the crows from their flock, would the control fade? Fairfax's eyes flickered with the hard light of reason, his mind racing through half-remembered diagrams and chemical equations. Their notes suggested reinforcement intervals, he said. Cycles. If the command source is disrupted, the conditioning should decay on its own. Quickly. Torres didn't need the rest spelled out. He and the doctor shared the same grim conclusion. The only hope of saving Culpeper was to neutralize the Crow twins at the source. Even if it meant climbing into the jaws of the beast, the courthouse clock tower itself. The sheriff checked his revolver. 4 rounds. 4 desperate chances against enemies who seemed to anticipate every choice before it was made. He weighed the weapon in his hand like a gambler, staring down his last coins. He turned to Fairfax, pressing his weathered notebook, and collected evidence into the doctor's hands. Stay hidden. Record everything. If I don't walk back down, you must. Someone has to warn the outside world. The physician's lips parted to object, but Torres cut him short with a final shake of the head. This is mine to carry. I failed Culpeper once. I will not fail it again. And with that vow burning in his chest, Sheriff William Torres slipped into the twisted streets of his hometown. Now a grotesque imitation of order. He moved with the caution of a soldier, the instincts from the Mexican-American War guiding each step as he crept past spirals of furniture and lattices of possessions, using them as cover against eyes too blank to see. The townspeople worked around him with chilling serenity, every movement synchronized, every gesture smooth and unhurried. Torres's boots made no sound on the cobblestones, yet he felt like an intruder in a temple. This was no longer Culpeper. It was an altar. And then the voices, they rolled across the town like the tolling of a bell, calm, measured, resonant enough to pierce bone. The twins were speaking in unison, their words carrying from the clock tower, without strain, reaching every ear with unnatural precision. Citizens of our research community. The crows intoned. Your contribution to the advancement of human knowledge is beyond measure. Your compliance has exceeded even our most optimistic expectations. Torres ducked behind an overturned wagon, his heart pounding. The words weren't only for the townsfolk. They were for him too, needling him, daring him, reminding him how small a revolver looked against a doctrine. The data gathered here, the twins continued, will allow us to refine our methods and extend them to larger populations. You should feel honored. Culpeper will be remembered as the birthplace of a new era, a civilization of order, of unity, of peace through science. A sickness knotted in Torres's stomach. He understood the implication. The project was ending. Just as the 23 vanished souls had been concluded in the lab, so too would the rest of Culpeper's men, women and children be discarded once their roles were complete. Witnesses could not be allowed to exist. He gripped his revolver tighter, the weight of it anchoring him as he scaled the courthouse's exterior steps. Each creak of the wood, each clang of his boot on iron carried him closer to the heart of the storm. Above, the twins' voices sharpened, slicing through the smoky air. Our methods have proven so effective that interest has already come from Richmond, from Baltimore, from Washington City. Government officials, universities, men of power eager to apply our science to manage unrest, to ensure stability. The words struck Torres harder than any bullet. This wasn't a plague contained to one backwater town. This was a seed. If the crows were not stopped here, their influence would spread through capitals, through armies, through nations. And William Torres, sheriff of Culpeper, climbed toward the clock tower with the dreadful knowledge that he might be the only barrier left between humanity and a future without free will. They weren't just researching, Torres realized. They were creating a technology, a tool of power that could be sold to the highest bidder. Corrupt officials, the dark forces, even the military. If they had the technology, they could rule entire nations with a few drops of chemicals. Sheriff William Torres reached the top floor of the clock tower. The half-closed wooden doors swung open, and he came face to face with the two men he had been hunting throughout his investigation, Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crow. But now, up close, they weren't human anymore. Their skin was taut, the wax cold as a morgue wax statue. Their every movement was unnaturally coordinated, like the gears of a giant clockwork. And what scared Torres the most was that they weren't surprised. Sheriff Torres, the two voices said, deep and precise. You arrived on time as expected. Your predictable actions have provided our research with invaluable data. Torres raised his gun. His grip was steadier than he had imagined. It is over. I arrest you for the murder of 23 citizens of Culpeper County. The twins turned. Their colorless eyes stared through him as blank as a microscope examining a specimen. Ezekiel tilted his head, his voice cold as steel. Law, justice. We have transcended such primitive concepts. Normal people are bound by morality, and we have freed ourselves from it. Nathaniel waved his hand toward the disfiguring town below. What you call crime, we call scientific progress. What you call murder, we understand as human progress. Torres's chest heaved with rage. You are not scientists. You are monsters. You torture and murder innocent people for the satisfaction of what you call research. Monsters. They repeated as if recording a new term. Interesting. But Sheriff, answer me. How is our research different from medical school experiments? How is it different from the military testing? New weapons. Why are you allowed and we are not? Torres squeezed the trigger, his voice as firm as a hammer. The difference is doctors save lives. Soldiers protect the weak. You only know how to kill hiding behind the name of science. A flash of disappointment flashed in those lifeless eyes. Ezekiel said, still steady, as if reading a report, "You've been more helpful than you think. Your investigation has given us a complete picture of how law enforcement responds to anomalies. Now, it's time for you to contribute more directly." Nathaniel pulled out a glass vial of clear liquid. The dim light from the clock tower shone through the liquid, shimmering like the venom of a snake. "This compound has been purified. Just one dose and you will experience liberation, the absolute objectivity of science." Torres understood their intentions. They wanted to turn him into a living laboratory. But his instincts as a cop, as a soldier, were strong. He didn't hesitate. Bang! The gunshot rang out, echoing through Culpeper like thunder. Nathaniel stepped back, his eyes widening for the first time in surprise. Dark blood stained his white shirt. But instead of collapsing, he examined his own wound as if it were a test specimen. Strange. Physiological response to ballistic trauma is consistent with the data. He whispered, his voice chillingly calm. Ezekiel, unshaken, pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Wound location left chest. Rate of blood loss, expected death within 15 minutes. Torres fired a second shot. The bullet penetrated Ezekiel's chest. He was unsteady, but still calm. His eyes flashed with only a hint of interest. The two voices merged into one, trembling, but still in perfect unison. "Sheriff, you gave us final data." "Excellent." The psychological profile of law enforcement under extreme pressure, as the twins had said, was now complete. Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crow fell to the cold bricks of the clock tower. Torres listened, and then he heard something that made his heavy heart blaze with hope, the sounds of chaos from the town below. The footsteps were confused, the cries of panic. The people of Culpeper were slowly emerging from their nightmare. The rigid mechanical movements were gone, replaced by the natural chaos of truly awakened people. Dr. Fairfax had been right. The twins' deaths meant the chemical effects of their presence were gone. Free will, individuality, all were returning to the surviving residents. Torres looked down at the two dying men. He felt no joy, no relief. There was only a dark weariness and pain for a community that had lost so much. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why did you do this to innocent people?" Ezekiel and Nathaniel, with their last breaths, gave him the answer that would haunt him forever. "Because we can. Humans are only resources for those with knowledge and power. The progress of science justifies any sacrifice. They died as they had lived in perfect synchronicity. Their last breaths left their lungs in unison. But even in death, those pale eyes remained wide open, staring up at the summer sky, lifeless cold, as if death were just the last data point in the experiment. In the weeks that followed, the truth of the Culpeper tragedy gradually emerged. Of the original 800 inhabitants, only 347 survived the summer of 1847. 23 were initially missing, never to be found. No matter how much the experimental forest was searched, no matter how much the soil and rocks were plowed, there was still no trace. The families who survived would carry that void for generations. Those who regained consciousness had fragmented memories. They remembered participating in bizarre rituals, drawing strange geometric shapes that turned the whole town into a living machine. But they could not explain why it was so important at the time. Dr. Fairfax devoted himself to taking notes, creating one of the earliest studies of mass psychological manipulation in the history of American medicine. As for Sheriff Torres, he wrote a full report listing the methods, the equipment, the compounds, and the terrible consequences. But when he sent it, he encountered invisible resistance. The report was classified as a local problem. Federal agents came, but instead of investigating, they confiscated all the evidence lab equipment notes chemicals. The official conclusion: two mentally disturbed individuals acting alone, posing no threat to national security. Fairfax was rejected by the medical community, his work dismissed as anecdotal, lacking scientific basis. The world of 1847 was not ready to accept the idea that the human will could be controlled by chemicals. Worse still, official records disappeared. In 1851, a fire burned down the local courthouse, burying all the records. Federal records were buried deep in the Washington archives, almost to the point of non-existence. The survivors had to choose stay and rebuild from the ashes or leave this haunted land. Many families left, and those who stayed hardly ever spoke of that summer. Torres continued to work as a police officer until 1863, but private diaries found after his death suggest he never quite lost sight of the idea that Crow's technique had been appropriated and developed elsewhere. Fairfax left Culpeper in 1849, heading for Europe. In Vienna and Paris, he helped lay the foundations of psychiatry and neurochemistry. But he never publicly acknowledged the Culpeper experience. The laboratory in the woods, filled with specimens and evidence, mysteriously caught fire just days after the twins' deaths. When the police arrived, all that remained was ashes and molten glass. No evidence, and that is the story of the summer of 1847. The summer when a small town almost became an experiment in a world without freedom. What do you think? If you were Torres faced with those two inhuman beings, what would you do? What time are you listening to this story? Where are you? A quiet room or in bed about to fall asleep? This is Sleepy History Tales, where creepy and mysterious historical stories lull you into a thoughtful sleep. The fire was no ordinary blaze. Witnesses noted that it burned at a temperature far beyond what natural combustion should allow. Someone, perhaps the twins themselves, perhaps someone protecting their secrets, had taken deliberate steps to erase every trace of their work. Yet in Culpeper County, whispers lingered. Local folklore insists that Ezekiel and Nathaniel Crow never fully vanished with the flames. Even today, residents occasionally stumble across eerie arrangements deep in the forests. Stones balanced in impossible stacks, branches woven into spirals, wild flowers placed in deliberate geometrical shapes. To some, it's just chance, the human mind trying to find order in chaos. But to others, it feels like the Crow brothers are still reaching out, testing, shaping, leaving reminders of what they once tried to control. Dr. Fairfax, long after the courthouse fire, pursued his research abroad. And what he found was chilling. Colleagues across Europe described nearly identical patterns, isolated towns marked by sudden coordinated behaviors, unexplained vanishings that followed geometric designs, and individuals possessing knowledge of chemical compounds and psychological techniques no small community should have known. The implication was staggering. Perhaps the Crow twins were not unique prodigies of madness, but members of something larger. A hidden network scattered across America and Europe, quietly experimenting with the human mind. If such a network truly existed, it might explain how two young men from rural Virginia mastered sciences and methods that outpaced even the great universities of their time. And yet, when the courthouse burned, much of that knowledge was lost forever. Whatever training they received, whatever goals they pursued, all of it perished in the fire, leaving behind only unanswered questions. But those questions still haunt us today. How vulnerable is the human mind to manipulation? How far will authorities go to conceal uncomfortable truths? And what happens when forbidden knowledge falls into the wrong hands? These mysteries from the summer of 1847 continue to echo almost 2 centuries later. And now, dear listener, I want to ask you, what do you think? Were the twins truly alone? Or were they part of a hidden circle that spanned oceans? Do you believe the truth was buried with them, or might traces of it still exist in forgotten archives and unmarked graves? Tell me in the comments, I'd love to know your thoughts. And since you've stayed with me until the very end, let me also ask, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are right now? If you enjoyed this strange journey into the shadows of history, don't forget to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Tap the notification bell and share this story with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. Because, my friends, there are countless tales like this, still hiding in the dark corners of America's past, waiting for us to uncover them together. Until next time, sleep well and beware the patterns in the forest.